Dr. Royce Fitz, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you so much. I've been yearning for this moment for a long time, so I'm honored, Dr. Dave.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of it, but we were just speaking before I started the recorder, and and you've been a long time listener, and I really appreciate that, especially considering who you are, because as I remarked, I feel like I've discovered a soul brother. I relate your book, which we'll be discussing, which is your 2023 book, Geography of the Soul: Dreams, Reality, and the Journey of a Lifetime. Oh, what a book. It is so deep and wide and wise. And so it feels like a real privilege to not only for you to have been a long time listener and appreciator, but to be able to appreciate you back as well.
Thank you. I'm a bit speechless with your sharing, and for me, at least in my world, I mean, your podcast has been on for a couple of eons, and as far as I know, you're one of the first in the area of psychologically oriented podcasts, and
I believe so. I've laid claim to that. So far, nobody's. I thought somebody's going to come along and say I'm full of it, but that hasn't happened.
Well, you may be full of it, and this is true as well. Yeah. And so periodically I do podcast searches, and years ago, probably in 2016, 2017, I found your podcast, and that's when I really got into listening to podcasts, and have just really appreciated the breadth of your interviews, the people you interview, and I secretly yearned, maybe not so secretly, I yearned. It's like, man, if I could ever get on Dr. Dave's podcast. And here it is, some version of a dream come true.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. The universe has brought it about. And speaking of a dream, a person that's been very important in your thought and life, as well as mine, Jeremy Taylor. Yes. Who you got to know as a friend, and you've taken his approach to dreams to heart, and I think we'll probably get to a place where I will invite you to put that model out there as you practice it and understand it as we go along. I've sort of got that in my plan here, and we're going to go on. You use a Scottish word, yes. And I just ask you how it's pronounced, and I think you said it's Stravag.
Exactly. Well done. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and boy, what a beautiful addition to our vocabulary that is. And so your book is really about you. I've been influenced a lot by the work of Joseph Campbell, and I wouldn't be surprised if you have been as well. But you kind of got the call, and it's scary to get the call because, as Campbell really makes it clear that the person who the call is actually is loaded with risks, and there are no guarantees. And but the person who doesn't answer the call, I seem to recall Campbell saying something like their life becomes like, it's like there's stones in their mouth or something. Their life becomes dry and very unsuccessfl. So let's
or they get swallowed by giant fish.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I love the biblical parallels that are there. Um, so you and I are gonna go. Your book is really about your wandering, you're getting the call, and where that call takes you, and in terms of geography, because place is another theme in the book, and the importance of place. But tell us about the call and what it required of you.
Well, when you ask that question, so there's a list that pops up in my brain
I'll bet, sure.
to what call are you referring? And if it's the call to do the hike, the Straveg, that specific uh, calling, back in 2009, as I was setting on
I,
the,
I'm
yeah,
going
yeah,
to
you,
cut.
you,
I'm going to cut you off there because
yes,
I'm
sir. Mm-hmm.
actually thinking we're definitely going to go there, but
Okay.
I'm thinking a little bit earlier is the call actually was to leave your marriage
Oh,
of many years and
yeah.
tell us because that's got to have been hard and a real
Uh,
struggle.
well, and still is,
I can imagine.
the kind of the systemic reverberations, both prior and after, it's an earthquake, that has many aftershocks. Yeah. So that, as I share in the book, that was a grueling, painful decision that took a long time to sort through and to try to find,
Uh,
as best as I can, as best as I could, a sense of integrity about what is it that is rumbling and stumbling and grumbling in my soul, and to look at the dissolution of at least of that part of the relationship was full of wailing and gnashing of teeth, if I can use a scriptural analogy. um, Very painful. And once I arrived at that decision, and this was a long time coming, and lots of deep therapy and deep conversations that my spouse and I had over many years, and to finally arrive at that and to make that decision, I felt like it was Armageddon in a way, emotionally, and a painful realization of the best possible truth, not the perfect truth, but the best possible truth that I could arrive at. That's when for me, made that decision. And and the because of my background, that, as you know, as I share in the book, I have a lot of built-in preconceptions about what relationships are and what rules are and what mandates are. And to cope with all of those voices, and sometimes very deep shame-based kinds of messages that were embedded in me, and to move into that, you know there was no way I was going to avoid that. That would have been nice, but to move in that and through that has been a kind of a fiery purging. And where I was then and where I know I am now, at least as best as I can determine, um, I'm in a much better space and place. I feel more authentic and connected with what I perceive as my real self. And at the same time, and I just need to say this, there is an ongoing appreciation that my former spouse and I have for each other, and for, in a sense, again, to use a religious term, a sense of being blessed by both to go as best as we can on into uh, our own different versions of health, healing, and wholeness.
Yeah. You used the reference to Jonah and the whale earlier, and which is such a good story, and 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 he was called by God to go and I think preach to the Ninevites, something
Yeah,
like that.
Nineveh.
Nineveh,
Yeah.
right? And and he didn't. Oh Lord, you can't ask this of me. These are
Yeah.
terrible people. Why would you want me to go witness to them? And
Mhm.
and so he tries to avoid it, and we know he gets swallowed by the whale and disgorged, and um, so
There's
one of the
that's a great example because there's a lot of puking involved, emotional purging, and
yeah,
again, it's actually called a big fish, not necessarily a whale, but the artists like to describe it
right,
as a whale because it makes more sense in our human language, but or imagery. But yeah, there's a lot of regurgitation that happens in listening to uh, again, not perfectly, in doing our best to listen to a call, to be
yeah,
authentic and real and
yeah,
be vulnerable in the world with others who are like the Ninevites, who are kind of wandering aimlessly a bit.
yeah, and lots of people get divorced, and as I think is never is not as easy as it's often depicted, but some people seem to do it rather casually. It should be clear to anybody listening to this conversation already, even if they haven't read your book, that
Mhm.
you struggle mightily to be honest, to be open, to and to listen to your soul's calling and your heart, and that's not an easy thing to do. So I just thought it was important for us to start there, because that's
Mm.
kind of the beginning in some ways of this remarkable journey. uh, so one of the things that you felt called to do was to go to a trail that you had heard about in England that I had
Mhm.
never heard of. Tell us about that, the Ridgeway National Trail. And
Right. So that was, I had never heard of it either. And as I shared just a little bit ago, in 2009, sitting on the prairie in my living room, reading the New York Times and in their travel section and seeing this description. And I believe the article was titled A Hike into History, which for me is always going to be a bit of a draw to read. So I started looking at the pictures and reading that. And it's like, this is the oldest continuously used trail in England or in the United Kingdom. And before the English Channel existed, it went all the way across uh, the English Channel into what we now know as France, and on and on and on. That the trail was created as the Ice Age receded. It left some version of a ridge, thus the name, the Ridgeway Trail. And so a portion of it is preserved in England. When I read that article and the ancientness, the prehistory upon prehistory, it just gripped me. And as a hiker and a lover of nature, I just knew, well, I made a promise. I'm going to hike that trail. So that's where, and then, with the dissolution of my marriage, as you brought up, and also the changes that were just exploding within my soul because of that, somehow I felt I need to take this hike. I need to take this walk, this straveg, because it's so symbolized at some level, beyond words, actually, uh, uh, a part of who I am, and also was going to open up for me a way to contemplate who in the hell am I now, and how am I in the world, and how is the world how does the world impact me? How can I impact the world?
Yeah, and you struggled with various emotions that would come up, which I totally understand. I identify a lot with you because you describe yourself as a sickly child, sick a lot, and not
Hmm.
an aggressive child, and
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, and I have had some of that same feeling and experience,
Hmm.
and um, and also your detestation, we'll get to this, of the military as a solution to the world's problems, et cetera, and fears
Hmm.
about that. So
Hmm.
when you go to England for the first time, it's scary. You don't know, are you going to get robbed?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
people often do these days when they travel.
Mhm,
And I
mhm,
say these days, but going back to ancient history, that's been
mhm,
around a long time. I
mhm,
went to Italy with my good friend. Uh, uh, I can't believe I block on names a lot, so I'll just keep going. Ron, and God, he got his passport stolen, and twice, and they gave it, and he's a long-haired guy too, and so
yeah.
Dr. Ron Alexander is his name, and
Mhm,
boy, he had a hard time getting the consulate to give him a new passport. Wait, you
mhm,
don't really care about this very much. You're not a very loyal American. Blah blah blah.
mhm,
So that kind of thing can happen, and so there you are, alone, cut off. Made a decision to cut yourself off from family and from place.
mhm.
Okay, you can pick it up from there.
Well, when we make gigantic changes in our self, we're going to feel really young and vulnerable anyway, no matter what age, and that continually was a surge and a resurge in me. So
Yes.
I've been overseas before, never alone though, and so I landed in London and felt like a little kid, 10 years old again, wandering and in a very, very unfamiliar space and place. And so, I would get lost. I'd get lost in the airport. I'd get lost once I got established at a bed and breakfast in this little section of London called Peckham, and so I felt very vulnerable and wondering and wandering, and I knew that at one level, as a psychotherapist, I know those aspects of the inner child and how that part is perhaps going to emerge in unexpected ways. To feel this, to walk this, to carry this, and to hold awareness, and so, it was just a new kind of teaching for me as I became more informed of my own inner self. And yet, I would not trade that vulnerability for anything. This has always been a part of my awareness, and yet to step into the depths of it in this soulful journey, uh, it was a painful, awful gift and beautiful experience.
Yeah, and I love the surges as you talk about it, the surges of the alternation between the sort of fear that would come up from the unconscious,
Mhm,
but then the surge of internal strength and joy and optimism and
mhm,
and looking forward to being on this adventure. And
mhm, mhm,
so that was wonderful. Um, the So one of the things that well, I think in the book you hop around a little bit, and I wondered, so the book becomes a wander in itself, a
mhm.
saunter through
A
these
Straveg.
experiences,
Yeah.
a stravage, and and So interestingly, in the book, you go back, I think, to talk about your military counseling
Mm-hmm.
experience. So let's
Mm-hmm.
go back now,
Mm-hmm.
and you're and that's very paradoxical. Tell us about why that's so paradoxical for you that you were led to
Well,
do this.
yeah, that sense of a straveg, which in a loose definition is kind of a defiant, aimless wander to uh, try to maintain one's own sense of self in the midst of what may be oppressive energies around us, and so that straveg I took in England opened me up beyond belief to stepping into new areas that I had avoided in my whole life, some by consciously avoiding and some by unconsciously avoiding. And so when I was done with that, I knew I needed to, get back to some of my practice and earn a living. And I had heard about this uh, um, service in military called military family life counseling. And so I started to think maybe that would be a way to help me continue to expand and to grow. And it did so much that that became, for me, this is a have to put this at the beginning of my chapter, because beginning of the book, because it's such a jarring, out of the box experience for me. And part of what I want to invite the reader is to realize this is okay for us to provoke ourselves into new growth and expansion and healing by going outside of the boxes of comfort that perhaps we've been born with or have been imprisoned by our life structure. So I decided, against a lot of voices inside me, to become a military family life counselor. And that means for me to be assigned by a contracting company that contracts with the Pentagon to serve military family members and military members in different locations. The one I write about is my very first one in upstate New York at
Yeah.
Fort Drum. And I'm not a conscientious objector, although I considered that many times in my life. I was able to get a deferment from the draft, and you and I are similar age, that we know what that was like to
Right.
get a deferment. And so it's like I'm going to be, scot-free, skate around this issue. But at this point in my life, it's like I have to face whatever this military industrial complex is. I have to step into it. And so that too was a calling. And for me to be on a base, as I've done several times since then, and be who I am, not a conscientious objector, and yet very anti-military in the way of my life and being, and how to be with these people that I pay, that I assign, in a sense, symbolically, to serve in our military industrial complex. And what will that look like? How will I handle myself? How can I be authentic as who I am and also invite authenticity from those ones that I serve? So that was that, I carry that paradox, and walking into that world was one of the most difficult things I've ever done. And I made friends with the paradox of the yin and yang. I don't think I could ever ask for a more profound, life-changing experience in my profession than to work with military people who are active, not veterans, not people that have suffered the after effects, but who are presently in service. And I, we as citizens send these wonderful folks into this paradoxical lifestyle. And it was a way for me to understand that, and also to love, to love these ones that I am called to serve and to be loved back.
Yeah. And we should mention, that you have, not only are you a licensed psychotherapist at this point, but also been through several seminaries. And so you have a spiritual training and mission to draw upon as well. And you describe how you were not allowed or encouraged to come to use those roles in any way for self-protection. You had to just kind of wander up to people and start talking to them and hopefully make a connection that you both would find meaningful.
Well, and what is unique about the position that I was assigned in is that while we supported the mental health clinics on any base, we were specifically not connected to them. So we are, our service with military members and families was to be off the record. Every conversation we had was not recorded in any way. It was mandated that we do not. And there were, of course, exceptions. If somebody was homicidal or suicidal or, some other self-harm, other harm, we would have a protocol to help them get the help. But our job was, very chaplaincy-like in a way, to wander around, connect, build relationships, and then people would invite us into their lives by asking for an appointment. Again, off the record and undocumented conversations.
Yeah. So that was a huge adventure in and of itself. And you and then towards the end of the book, I'll mention that all of these issues that you face are so multifaceted, the way you connect everything and you see everything as a related whole. And so
thank you for noticing that. That's correct.
Yeah. And so not only are there your own struggles and some sense of guilt from having been able to not have to go to war, because of a student exemption, but also towards the end of the book, you get into your father's guilt around military service, which didn't happen. We don't need to go through all of that here. I invite people to look for that in the book. But it's an example of this sort of multifaceted, multi-dimensional space that you move us through, that your life moves through and that you move through. One of the things I want to make sure I say here that blows me away is, there's so much wisdom in the writing, I think, and the telling of your tale. And somehow you avoid cliches. And, when I try to picture myself writing about this stuff or any writing that I do, I'm just aware of how many cliches, being in this field that we're in of human, existential humanistic psychology generally.
Yes.
And there's so many books that we've read and so many influences that it's easy, I find, to just fall into the tropes and the cliches of this field. And you really don't do that. Was that a struggle, or is that just a natural outflowing of spending so much time alone?
So your reflection helps me, and I appreciate that that you notice I did not use cliches or tropes. My honest effort as I wrote this story, this pilgrimage of myself, in my imperfect way, is to be authentic and
Yeah.
vulnerable. This isn't a confessional kind of memoir. This is, though, a, 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 a an imperfect way for me to be as authentic as possible in the world. And I don't have simple answers for the anguish and pain that we experience as humans. And yet I feel like we need to be in the space and place where there is anguish and pain, or for me, it doesn't do any good to be alive. I have to get dirty, and the world is dirty, and it's also earthy and beautiful. So my effort is to, as best as possible, to be vulnerable and to be authentic about this. You mentioned humanistic and existential. That those are words that make my heart pump faster and with energy, because
Yeah.
this is where the rubber meets the road. How does love and compassion get lived out in the realness of our life experience? I'm not one to believe that, I'm not a very optimistic person. I don't necessarily trust that we're going to be okay in whatever end there is. And for me to uh, be involved, as on a molecular level, and that's all I can do, is be involved in a molecular level of being compassionate and as healing as possible. That is my goal,
Yeah.
with the sense of honest despair that floats into us and out of us, as well as this sense of hope and healing. The verdict is not yet in on our life forms.
Right. I struggle with that myself on this show, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to not be in denial, but at the same time, to find to find some hope, and to hopefully stimulate some hope in my listeners.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, I love your reference to our rattlesnake brain in
Mm-hmm.
talking about anxiety, and that we have
Mm-hmm.
this amygdala brain that just it has its own life. It snaps in very quickly.
It does. And, this is our instinct. It's helped our life form to survive as it does other life forms. And yet we rely on it way too much. And uh, part of my training and background is in Bowen family systems, and looking at anxiety as one of the primary instincts of who we are as a species. As all species, have that millions of years old survival mechanism that we call anxiety. And so we're quick to strike. We're quick to imagine that there is danger around every corner. And sometimes there is. So how do we navigate with awareness to respect that there is danger? And at the same time, how do we coach ourselves to be as full of thought as is possible, to be an agent of thinking, an agent of change, an agent of compassion in the midst of this? Not easy. And I could get into my own sermonic rattlesnake reactions about social media and how that permeates our system to be even more reactive.
Yeah, yeah. One of the places that I wanted to go was to, well, I want to give you there's so much I've sort of got little notes to myself here of all
Yeah.
those sort of waste stations, of the medicine wheel stones in Wyoming, and the the standing stones along the trail that you were on in the UK. But we only have so much time here. So I wanted to give you a chance to talk about your approach to dreaming, because that's part of the subtitle of the book. And you actually work some of your own dreams in the book, so we get to see how you work with it. And I know that we mentioned Jeremy
Taylor.
and Jeremy Taylor and his projective group Dreamwork. So,
well,
this is your chance to give us a shot of that.
yeah. And I have deep passion, as you know, and as the book expresses, a deep passion about our dream world. A moment ago, I mentioned that anxiety is a deeply inbred instinct, and I also believe that whatever we call dreams, that nudge inside of us that dreams, is at least a 2 million-year-old instinct. And it seems to be an instinct in some way with many, if not most, life forms, some kind of nighttime nudging that happens inside of our brain. So when I talk about dreams, I believe these are our instinctual efforts to continually rewire us spiritually and emotionally and physically to move towards some version of health, healing, and wholeness. And when I met Jeremy Taylor through his first book, by the way, is where I met him, and then a couple of years later met him in person, and he became, for me, a very, very good friend and dream teacher, my dream mentor. And his approach in dreams helped me understand that there is a way to look at dreams without necessarily, although it would be good to become Freudian and be deeply embedded in that form of dream work, or Jungian or Gestalt-ish or other forms of dream approaches. All of those are wonderful. What spoke to me so much about Jeremy's understanding of dreams and working is what's called projection. That this is what, Dave, you and I are doing right now in our conversation. We're projecting some other experiences in our lives onto each other. And we do this in the dream world. And so how can we, as just normal human beings, lay people who aren't trained in sophisticated dream theories, how can we use dreams to help us understand ourselves and our species and how the world works? And the projective method is essentially, generally in a group, works best, is where a dreamer will share their dream. And instead of us analyzing the dream and looking at necessarily all the archetypes, etc., that are a part of the dream world, what if the listeners were simply to say, I'm going to borrow this dream and treat this dream as my own. I'm going to borrow it. And the way I'll talk about it is in the I message. If this is my dream, I. So I keep it on the I keep this on myself, and I simply reveal how I am experiencing this dream, and let the dreamer absorb that, either take it in or discard it or just wonder about it. This builds an amazing intimacy and amazing vulnerability in group settings. And when I discovered this, standing in a bookstore in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a long time ago, reading Jeremy's book, it's like, this is it. This is my calling. This is my calling.
Yeah, and before we started talking on mic, I shared with you that Jeremy was a frequent guest in my class that I taught, an undergraduate course called Myth, Dream, and Symbol. And his book was one of the texts that we used. And
wonderful.
And I've also been in a number of dream groups over the years. I'm not in one right now, but have been in them with friends. And my experience as a teacher was I did have a lot of exposure, to other theories, and particularly to the psychodynamic, more or less Freudian kind of things. And it's very hard to not have that influence me. And so sometimes when I was the teacher, I would feel like, well, doggone it, I am an expert. And and sometimes the person would be responding in the I to the dreamer, and inside I'm going, oh man, that's so wrong. But I'm not saying that out loud. And then the dreamer just comes to life and says, oh wow, that what you said really touched me, and I realized so I needed to be chastened from my hubris around my my expertise.
Well, I get my own cringes. I love Jungian approaches and Freudian approaches, especially the newer understandings of Freudian psychology and psychoanalysis and some of the others. And it's like, I get it, and when I hear, if I can say this, when I hear one of those folks, working a dream, and they're using, the language of interpretation, I cringe. It's like, oh, that's so brilliant. And let's just be honest and say, well, in my experience, this is the way I experience this dream. So, I go back and forth, and I have clients that sometimes don't want me to borrow their dream and use the I messages.
Oh,
they
really?
want me to explain.
What does it really mean? Yeah. What does it really mean?
Yeah. So, there's always this tension. We always want an authority to kind of, tell us outside of ourselves what, quote, the truth is. It's hard to take responsibility for our own sense of self. That's the anxiety. If I'm in a healthy enough space with a client, I'll say, okay, we can talk about it this way, and let's look at, the symbols of this dream, and I'll drop using the I messages, because the relationship is saying, this is okay to do. I get it. So I'm not going to be rigid about this. I do want, though, to challenge us to, in this deep sense, let's take responsibility for our own sense of self as best as we can.
Yeah. There's another thing I wanted to discuss with you, which is altered states of consciousness. And for one thing, I've been interested in altered states of consciousness from graduate school on. And so it's been a theme in a lot of things that I've studied and done and so on. And one thing I wanted to note is travel in and of itself is an altered state of consciousness. That's a guaranteed way. If you want to go someplace and do what you did, that you're not familiar with, and let yourself get disoriented, because, the excitement of getting lost sometimes, both the fear and excitement of getting lost, that definitely is an altered state.
That's a really good point. Altered states shake us out of how we experience, quote, our normal world. In the dream world, sometimes we talk about the jester, the one who kind of shocks us with a different perspective, and that's what an altered state is. In your podcast, you've sometimes interviewed people who move into the psychedelic realm of looking at how plant medicine can help us. And I love that approach without understanding a lot about it. That also, though, reminds me of the dream world. These are other ways of having
Yeah.
altered states so that we can look at the world in a new perspective. The present solutions ain't working in our world. We do need to have alternative understandings in order for us to have new ways of healing, new ways of running our systems of government. The present isn't working.
Yeah. You mentioned family systems, and that approach is being used quite a bit in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And I do want to put you on the spot and ask you, have you used plant medicines yourself?
I have, and not to the extent that part of me yearns to have some kind of deep and guided long-term experience, and yet I have. So one of the quandaries I'm in, one of the difficulties is, while some states, U.S. states, are rather progressive about how this is approached, the federal government is not. And
Right.
so because I've worked in federal institutions, military places, that is, it doesn't matter what the medical facts are. They have rules and regulations, and so I have to adhere to those for the contract's sake, as well as for that sense of how does the federal government manage this stuff? It's way behind what medicine probably is promoting. Again, the system is rigid and fixed. So have I? Yes, not very much. I had a psychedelic experience a couple of years ago, a little over a year ago, actually. And it was in an amazing location with amazing leaders. And I felt like this was very dreamlike. And because of my work in the dream world and that experience, it was another level of opening that convinced me that this is a way for us to move even more into the direction of healing with alternative understandings of what that can look like.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being so candid and sharing your experience around that. And
because of that, I may not get hired again by a military. So thank you, Dave.
Okay. Well, I hope I didn't bring that about.
No, that's a quandary that I carry. So,
yeah.
I tease you with that because I tease myself with that. It's a paradox.
Yeah. Well, it's time for us to kind of wind down, and I'm wondering if there's anything that we haven't touched on that you wanted to get across in our conversation.
Well, one of the aspects that the reason I wrote this book is to invite and provoke others to explore their own sense of self through their sense of place, their physical sense of place, and also through their spiritual and existential sense of place. Not everybody has to take a walk on the oldest road in England and Europe. However, in order for us, I believe, to move even more into authenticity and to be a healing agent in the world, we need to do our own spiritual existential stravaig, to move outside of the box, and sometimes to break rules for the sake of health, healing, and wholeness. So, to move back into my theological realm, when Jesus talks about, are we made for the letter of the law, or is the law made, or are we made for the spirit of the law? And I believe we're made for the spirit, and that involves risks. And your provocative questions to me today, reminds me of some of the risks that I've taken, and I just invite all of us to do their own version of this strabag.
Well, that's a beautiful wrap up, actually. And
thank you.
So let me just say what a pleasure it is to meet you on this plane, on this digital plane, and
well, and you're calling me a brother. It just touches me deeply.
Yeah.
And thank you for this experience. Yeah. And brothers of the soul. So.
Yes. And so, soul brother Royce Fitz, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you. Very honored. Thank you very much.